Okay, we're on Chapter 1, Section 2 of the American Civil War and Reconstruction Unit. Um, where we left off from Section 1 is that the war has started between the North and the South. They had just issues that they tried to resolve for many years that they just couldn't, and war seemed to be the only answer. So, the southern states leave the United States Union, and war begins at Fort Sumter when the South attacks Union-occupied fort. Early in the war, it was unorganized and chaotic. They really, the South had to create an entire nation, let alone, create their army and everything like that. But in the North itself, they had to deal with, half their men in their army had left, and half their leaders have left, and they had to fill those positions. And and where those men went was to the South. And just trying to get all the men together, supplies, just cannons, guns, trains to move everything. It just took a lot of time and effort. So, let alone just time to train the soldiers. So it's just really chaotic and unorganized, but, battles are happening, and they are deadly battles, such as the Battle of Shiloh, Antietam, as we talked about in the last section. It was a Union victory, but it also allowed the North to, at a point of strength after the victory, to declare that all those slaves in the South are free. The Emancipation Proclamation issued by President Lincoln. And then the Battle of Fredericksburg. So even after the Battle of Antietam, which is a victory for the Union, but it wasn't like a total victory, since the Southern Army just retreated. They weren't destroyed. So really, as we talked about before, the Northern Army needs to destroy the Southern Army. So without actually doing that, it's really hard to pick up, the goals and the wins that they need to. But the Battle of Fredericksburg, it was just a bad battle for the North. A lot of casualties, and it was just a major Southern victory. It was fought in November, and it was the last battle for a few months, because they usually stopped fighting in the wintertime just because of the bad conditions. But it was just a major. It was just, during that winter of 1862 into 1863. It was just a bad time to be a Union soldier and a Northerner, because they was just going so bad. The war wasn't going their way. Part of the reason was just because of the South had General Lee. He was an expert tactician, and Lincoln needed to find his General Lee for the North. He went through many generals, probably about 5 in those first 2 years of war, and just couldn't find anybody that knew how to get the job done. So even though after the Battle of Antietam, the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, it wasn't until January 1st, 1863, that it became, that it took effect. So after January 1st, 1863, that's when all the slaves were officially freed in the South. So now we're in 1863. It's already been 2 years of war. The South is gaining momentum, but really the feelings on both sides, the North and South, the feelings about the war really changed after the Emancipation Proclamation. It just became a war of, at the beginning of the war, it was a war of many different issues, but in this particular time after the Emancipation Proclamation, the main issue became slavery and being able to abolish slavery. It's like, yes, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation to free the slaves in the South, but remember the South was its own nation, so its power really wasn't, in full effect. He really had to win the war for the Emancipation Proclamation to really, really take effect, because they needed to occupy the South and make sure that the slaves were free. So it really became like became the central issue for the war. Um, After the Emancipation was issued, slaves did begin leaving their plantations. Now you're thinking, like, how did they just pick up and leave? Well, think of it, a lot of their slave owners, plantation owners, they were off to war. So there was really no one really to force them to keep, to stay on the plantation after this. But at the same time, like, where were they going to go? Some left, some didn't, and many went to the cities to find refuge, and there was big refugee camps for slaves. But a lot of them did leave their plantations. They couldn't prevent, like we said, slave owners couldn't prevent them from leaving since they were fighting in the war. But now at 1863, after Emancipation Proclamation, after that took into effect, African Americans were now allowed to fight for the Northern Army. For the first 2 years of the war, it was just white Northerners that were fighting in the war. But now, African Americans who wanted to join the fight and fight for that cause to end slavery were finally given the opportunity to fight in the war. So, 1863, Robert E. Lee is gaining major victories against the North. The South they had just had superior leadership. We talked about Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson. Those were the two big figures that they just had a tactical advantage over the North. The Northern leadership just wasn't good. At the Battle of Chancellorsville, the it was just such a major Southern victory, despite like the Northern Army just had, I think, almost double the men, but through skill and tactics, the Southern Army were able to gain a big victory. But it's not that the Confederate Army didn't have their struggles. At the Battle of Chancellorsville, Stonewall Jackson was actually killed during. Actually, not during the battle. It was actually at night. Stonewall Jackson was riding along the Confederate lines, making sure everybody was in their place, and he was shot from his own men, thinking that Stonewall was a Union, part of the Union. So it was actually friendly fire that killed Stonewall Jackson. So it was, just a big blow to the Confederacy when he died. General Lee just depended on him so much. Also, like we discussed in the previous section, the South just didn't have that many factories to make things, and they just weren't supplied that well, especially because the Anaconda effect of strangling the South. They weren't allowed to get any kind of shipments from anywhere around the nation. So the Southern Army was low on supply. So their time was really ticking. So General Lee decided to take the war into the northern states to speed up the war, because he figured if he needed to speed up, he figured he needed to speed it up the war, because he was so low on supplies, and if he can get into the north, he can force the Northerners to quit the war, because he would make become more of the home life of Northerners. To this point, all the fighting was done in Southern territory. The Northern home front, they didn't really experience the terrors of war, of having battles in their own fields and everything like that. So if Lee could bring that fight to the North, maybe they would stop their resolution. So really, there was two fronts of the war. There was the Eastern Front, which we've been mainly talking about so far, Virginia along the Atlantic coast. That was the Eastern Front, and then the Western Front is the areas along the Mississippi River. So on the Western Front, Ulysses S. Grant was the general, and he was actually having success out west. It was almost the complete opposite of what was happening in the Eastern Front. So his goal out west was to take control of the Mississippi River. If you take control of the Mississippi River, the South is split into half, and their main source of transporting goods is ceases to exist. So he has successes in battles, Battle of Shiloh, and moving down Fort Donelson, and finally he arrives at the city of Vicksburg, which is sitting right on the Mississippi River. Now the city has these high cliffs, and they're able to barricade them. The people are able in the army are able to barricade themselves into the city, so it is not easily attacked or taken over. So what Grant does is he has to siege the city, meaning that he had to surround it and cut it off from all supplies. So at that moment, it became a waiting game of when are the people of Vicksburg going to give up. And so Vicksburg falls, then the Mississippi River and all its trade routes are in northern control. So if you look here, this is the Eastern Front, and it shows like where a lot of the fighting happened in what years. And then this is the Western Front. It's obviously much bigger, but there's Vicksburg. You can see the Mississippi River. And you can see how the Mississippi River just, it has so many tributaries and everything like that, and just the trade routes. So if the Union Army is on their doorstep, Grant's army, and if they can win at Vicksburg, they can control the whole entire Mississippi. All right. So generally, he needs to take his army north to make a big statement. If he can get that victory in the north, that'd be big. So his goal is to make the Northerners lose interest in this bloody war. He needs to resupply his army, and he does that by raiding northern towns and farms. So they never, the Southern Army was not eating well. They didn't have a lot of, like you said, what they grew in the South was cotton and everything like that. There was regular farms, with livestock, but a lot of them were being destroyed, especially in Virginia, because of all these battles. So they went into the north and raided all these towns for all their livestock, and they took guns and just clothing, and then eventually, if they can work their way into Gettysburg, they can then. If they work their way into Pennsylvania and swoop down, and they can hopefully take Washington, D.C. That was their plan. So you can see, so they're starting, this is Lee's army, in the winter of 1862 into 1863. They're here, and then they win the battle. They win the battle at Challengersville, and all of a sudden they start marching north. Okay. And so you can see their loop that they're trying to make is that if they march around, maybe they can get behind Washington, D.C. and attack D.C. Now, if they're able to win at Washington, D.C., or at least besiege it or take it over, then that would be huge for the Confederacy. All right, but they will end up meeting at this town of Gettysburg. You can see at the last, the Union Army kind of follows them, okay, and they're trying to block them from entering D.C. So the blue is the Union Army. So they end up actually meeting at this small town in Pennsylvania. So in 1863, we had the Battle of Gettysburg. It's just in this small farming town of Pennsylvania, but it's a perfect place for the battle because there's all these roads that lead into the town from all different directions. So all these supplies and men and everything like that converge at this one little place. It's almost like a wheel, and all the spokes lead into the center of the wheel. The Confederate, like I said, the Confederate Army is looking for that major victory in the North. But the Union Army needs to get Lee out of the North because it just looks terrible that Lee was even able to get into Northern Territory, and they need to cut off any kind of path that directs them to Washington, D.C. So why is it important? This battle here. It's just because this is really the standing point. This, probably the largest battle, the Civil War, just of importance. And it was really, just such a. It was the South's chance, one last chance to. I don't want to say one last chance, but their best chance to win the war. It's called the high water mark of the Confederacy because this is the closest they ever came to victory. So if they win this, if the South wins this battle, they really almost win the war because then they would have a clear path to Washington, D.C. Now the Union Army needs a win so they can continue to have support in the North for the war. If the Union Army keeps losing, no one likes to support a losing team, so they're not going to gain that much support from the North. They need Northern supplies and everything like that, the support of the people so they can keep this war going and to finish it. But that requires the Northern people to be on board with it. If the Northern people get sick of the war, then the war ceases to exist, and they have to recognize the Confederacy. Let alone they have to defend. At this point, we always talk about the Confederate soldiers defending their homeland. At this point, the Union soldiers are defending their homeland. So, Battle of Gettysburg starts at July 1st, 1863, and on June 28th, 1863, President Lincoln appoints a new commanding general of the Army, General George Meade. He's a cautious general. He's only 5 days on the job of leading the whole entire army, and he doesn't want to mess up on his first week of work. So it's a 3-day battle, this Battle of Gettysburg. It actually happens accidentally. Like I said, Gettysburg is has roads like spokes of a wheel, and all of a sudden these Union troops and these Confederate troops run into each other and have a small skirmish, but the skirmish just escalates because more men keep pouring in from either side, and it just escalates on the first day. And then after the first day, it's really Confederate victory, but the Confederates were unable to take the high ground. And so the Union Army digs in at 9-1 and takes the high ground in the town. And then the second day, there's more fighting, but neither army has achieved victory. The North still has the high ground; they were able to defend it, and the Southern Army is still prepared to fight and try to take that high ground. But after 2 days of battling at Gettysburg, neither the Union or Confederate Army had achieved victory. So the Union, I'll show you a picture in a second here. The Union Army position was shaped like a fish hook along the hills around the town. And so General Lee thought he was very, very close to achieving. He said he just needed a little bit more time on day 2 of the battle to achieve victory. He thought on day 3 he for sure would be able to break the Union line on this fishhook line on the high ground. So he decided to attack. On day 2 he attacked the 2 separate positions. I'll show you the map here. On day 2, Lee attacked here and here, but he was unable to take either Little Round Top here and go this way and try to swoop into the Union line, and he was unable to here. So he figured he weakened these lines on the edge on day 2. So Lee was figuring that George Meade would take men here that were in the center to shore up these lines that were battered the day before. So Lee was expecting a weakened center line. So on the 3rd day, he just devises his plan. It's called Pickett's Charge. It's known as Pickett's Charge. Lee wants to send 13,000 Confederate soldiers across a vast field. It's over a mile long, with fences and obstacles, to go straight into the center position, defensive position of the Union line. So he wants to send all these men right in smack into the middle of the Union line. So this is a picture of, so they have to cross all these fields. See, that's a long way to get to this line. You can see there's like, this is definitely the old style tactic. You just line it up, but look how easy that is for the Union Army. They're actually behind a stone wall, a small stone wall, and they're just firing right into the Confederate line. This is just more of a picture. Like the South did, some of the Southerners did march a mile across the field and reach the line, but they had zero success once they got to the line. They just couldn't break through the Union defensive line once they got there. So if you want to, there is this link here to watch Pickett's Charge from the movie Gettysburg. The movie Gettysburg is fantastic if you haven't ever seen it. It's just very historically accurate, and it is long. It is about 3.5 hours long, but it's well done, and it's such a great depiction of the whole entire battle of Gettysburg. The first, second, and third day. The only thing bad about the movie is the fake beards and mustaches, but everything else was great. So the Confederate attack fails, and it just ends in a major defeat for the Confederates. That was their one. So that was their one shot. Like Lee was going, he was swinging for the fences, you would say. He was really going for it, but it just didn't. Just wasn't successful. After the battle, General Lee takes full blame for the loss. Up to that point, to the Battle of Gettysburg, Lee was able to outsmart and outwit and outduel any of the Union generals. But at that point, he just thought he was invincible. And he thought if he would task his men to charge that center of the Union line, that, my God, that they were going to do it. But it just didn't happen this time. It was just too overconfident. So on the Union side, they were very, very happy and victorious, but they failed to pursue the weakened Confederate army and end the war. This angered President Lincoln very much. He just wanted the war to end, and if they were after Gettysburg, after that major victory, if they were able to, get him while he's down, kind of a thing. Lee was down. If they were just able to pursue Lee and crush their army right after the battle. If he was able to pursue Lee right after the battle, the war would have ended. So he needed to. So Lincoln's just frustrated at this point. Now, I will say that at the 4th of July, 1863, the day after the 3rd day battle, so like the battle was July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, July 4th, when the battle was over, it just stormed like crazy, and it would have been really hard to chase after the Confederate army. So the aftermath. So it's actually the bloodiest battle of American history. 51,000 killed, wounded, or missing. 28,000 Confederates. I mean, that's a very high percentage. That's over a third and almost half of Lee's total force of about 80,000 soldiers. So that's just massive casualties. After the Battle of Gettysburg, Lee just never had enough men or firepower to launch a major offensive attack again. So into the Western Front, we have the Siege of Vicksburg, like we talked about where they're surrounding the city of Vicksburg and just waiting for them to give up. But on July 4th, they finally surrendered. And why it seems like almost coincidence that they surrendered on July 4th, but the commander of the Confederate Army in Vicksburg said, "We will not be treated more respectfully than if we surrender on July 4th." And that's why they surrendered that day. Obviously, because it's our Independence Day. But the people inside were just starving and they were surrounded, so they eventually gave up. So it was just a major victory for the Union Army at Vicksburg. Now they have control of Mississippi, and this Confederacy is split in half. So there it is right there. So now it is under Union control. So any supplies coming from here cannot reach these other, and vice versa. So pretty much the war has ended over here in the Western Front. And really you only have to worry about one front, which is the Eastern Front. So now the Union Army has major victories at Gettysburg and Vicksburg. The total momentum of the war switches to the south, to the north. The South has lost so many men at Gettysburg. They lost the entire city at Vicksburg. But General Lee's army is still not destroyed after that of Gettysburg. President Lincoln is impressed by General Grant's victory at Vicksburg and gives him full control of the entire Union Army. Grant's main task is to totally dismantle Lee's army of Northern Virginia. All right, so after the battle, in November 1863, President Lincoln goes to Gettysburg, and he's really not even supposed to speak that day. It's just really they're opening a cemetery in Gettysburg for all the soldiers that died, and but he's asked to give a speech, and it's not a long speech. So usually, there was a few speakers that day to speak on behalf of the soldiers and the war, and the guy before him, before Lincoln spoke, he was on stage for close to 2 hours. So when Lincoln gives up and gives this 3-minute speech, the people are like, "Whoa, what's going on with this?" Like the guy before him was 2 hours, and the president is only up there for 3 minutes. It's only a 275-word speech, but it is one of the most famous speeches in history because just how compelling and just how meaningful each word is. It was to honor the dead that fought there, but also to keep persistence to carry out the war to the last full measure. Is that we have lost so much during this war. We can't give up now. We need to see it through. There's too much to gain. And there's too much to lose if we stop now. So it was just words of encouragement to carry out the war and to do what's right and to end slavery. It's just one of the most memorable speeches. Here's the whole entire speech here. It's not that long, but it's just so compelling. So right now at the end here, it's after Gettysburg, after Vicksburg. It's 1863. The North has control, but the Confederacy is not defeated yet. There's still almost 2 years of war to go after this, and we will pick that up in section 3.